诸位共赏。使者在临。
Hey guys, Mr. Poki here, back with another video. So we're back with another CN unit analysis, this time featuring Blade. From what CN bros have seen so far, Blade is definitely not lacking in the damage department. And as you guys have seen from my previous video regarding a potential Blade resurgence mechanic, the possibilities with Blade are definitely endless, right? Especially if you can manage to use him to his full efficiency. But that being said, I don't think that Blade is an extremely flexible unit. As we'll see later on in the team composition, he really requires a very rigid team comp for him to truly shine, and without these units supporting Blade, then his maximum efficiency would not be easily displayed to the player base, right? So without further ado, let's get into today's content. Alright, so regarding Blade's forward, he is our very first 5-star win DPS, and he is our most skill point friendly DPS unit that we have right now. Because essentially, Blade only needs to cast his skill once every 4 turns. And yes, you guys have heard that right, it is every 4 turns and not every 3 turns, right? So just stay tuned to find out even more. The release of Blade also introduces the potential of more HP percentage scaling DPS units in the future, because the new current 4-piece relic set is perfect for Blade, as well as any future HP percentage scaling DPS, right? So I wouldn't be surprised in the future if MiHoYo were to release similar units with a similar playstyle to Blade. Next, Blade is also our only DPS that can reliably solo clear MOC 1 to 10, right? There are a ton of MOC 10 clears with solo Blade in CN, and they are not E6 S5 Blade. I'm talking literally like E0, E1, E2 Blades, as long as he has the right build, right? So this might not appeal to most players that are using proper full 4-man team comps, but for those of you guys who want to take on some challenge runs like a solo Blade similar universe clear or solo Blade MOC clear, then Blade is gonna really help you guys in that department, because no other DPS can sustain as well as Blade himself right now, right? Generally speaking, Blade is also a very simplistic DPS unit, right? He doesn't really have a lot of fancy mechanics like such as Sile's Resurgence or Lightning Lord. He doesn't really have any other thing going on with his kit, like he can't really apply debuffs like well. For Blade, he really is just a very simplistic deal as much damage as possible whenever his turn arises, and sustain his own HP, because HP is his primary source of damage output, right? On this note, Blade also does not like to be paired with preservation units such as Depart and March 7 and possibly future preservation units, because number one, preservation units in general has the highest taunt value in the game, right? And this reduces the chance of Blade getting hit, and therefore less likely for Blade to stack up his follow-up charges, which is gonna affect his DPS output. And secondly, the entire shield mechanic heavily counters Blade's entire kit, right? Because he needs to consume HP to deal more damage. It is not only if an enemy deals damage to you, then his follow-up is going to be triggered, or his enhanced attack, or his ultimate is going to deal more damage, right? He needs to actually reduce his own personal HP. So having a shield prevents that from happening, right? And because of this, he does not like to be paired with preservation units, and that is generally what we understand from Blade so far. Now let's talk about Blade's common misconception, and I'm going to start with a very big one that most CN bros, or rather the major CN content creators, haven't even discovered yet, is that as of the time of this recording, as of version 1.2, Blade's enhanced states actually lasts 4 turns, which includes the turn he used his skill, right? It is not 3 turns. Because of this, after casting his skill and then Blade uses his auto attack, including that turn where he casts his skill, he has an enhanced attack for 4 times before he can cast his skill again. Now this can be seen as a double-edged sword, because on one hand, Blade now uses even less skill point over more turns, right? Because previously we thought that he used 1 skill point every 3 turns, but really right now Blade only uses 1 skill points every 4 turns. So from a skill point economy perspective, this is going to be a benefit. But on the flip side, if you guys have seen my most recent Blade Resurgence video, this means that because Blade can only cast his skill every 4 turns, he will not be able to synchronize with Bronya's 100% ultimate uptime, right? Because he cannot cast his skill every 3 turns, it's every 4 turns. So there are definitely some benefits and there are also definitely some drawbacks, and we have to factor this into like our ultimate uptime, our damage calculation, all that kind of stuff. Now the second common misconception is that Blade's attack percentage scaling is really poor. Even though it says it's 40% on his enhanced basic and ultimate as well as 44% on his follow-up, all of these are at level 10 tracers. This in reality only translates to a roughly 8.9% of the final damage output. And the remaining of Blade's damage scaling, it is all contributed by HP percentage. Hence, Blade should not be built as a hybrid unit, right? You should never ever stack attack percentage on Blade. You should just stack on as much HP as humanly possible. Do not try to stack on both attack and HP, right? Because his scaling with attack is extremely poor, right? Regardless if there's diminishing returns on stacking HP or not, right? Just do not stack attack percentage on Blade. For the third misconception, he is not a berserker unit, right? What is a berserker unit? A berserker unit is basically like Eidolon, right? Eidolon's damage output actually increases the lesser health he has. But this is not Blade, right? His damage does not increase as his health gets lower, right? Blade essentially just converts the damage received, right, into his health pool into a higher damage output, such as his ultimate basically, right? 90% of his total HP loss per interval. But there's absolutely no benefits in staying in low health, right? Blade requires the sustain. And to further add on to this point, going into point number 4, when casting Blade's ultimate, if he is at less than 50% HP, the ultimate actually acts as a heal, right? So if your Blade is at like 10% HP or 20% HP, then the ultimate will actually restore health to Blade, right? And therefore will not consume any HP percentage to boost his damage. This is why you see, it is really not a good idea to stay on low health with Blade, because if your health is too low and your ultimate does not deal any damage to your own health pool, then he might not be able to stack up the maximum cap of 90% maximum health damage received, right? So this is why Blade should always try to stay above 50% HP whenever possible. But that being said, achieving the 90% max HP cap on the highest ultimate damage is not very difficult, right? Because after casting one skill, which results into 4 enhanced basic attacks, Blade will already have dealt 70% max HP to himself, right? So if the ultimate is cast as long as Blade is above 70% HP, then this will add up to another minimum of 20% HP onto Blade, right? So this totals to 90% HP. So achieving the maximum 90% HP threshold for the maximum ultimate damage is not very difficult, but you still need to remain at a relatively healthy level, right? You cannot stay in red health with Blade. Number 5, unlike other DPS, Blade actually wants to focus on his basic attack traits as well. I know for most of our other DPS right now, we are often advised to just ignore the basic attack because we're just going to be spamming his skill, but this is not for Blade, right? Because his enhanced attack actually does scale off of his basic attack. So because of this, we definitely need to level up Blade's basic attack traces. Lastly, our very last misconception, Blade actually heavily prefers a crit damage chest compared to a crit chance chest, unlike other DPSs, right? Because Blade does have 12% crit chance in his traces, and if we're going to be using the new 4-piece set, that's going to be 16% when it goes to 2 stacks, and if we're going to be using the new 2-piece Rutilant Arena or Salsoto, that's another 8% crit chance, and if you do manage to get Blade's signature Lightcone at S1, that's another 18% crit chance, and this combined totals to 59% crit chance with absolutely 0 main stats or 0 substats, right? So this is 54% from all this plus the 5% base crit chance that everybody have. So because of this, it is extremely easy to stack on a lot of crit chance with Blade, just get a little bit of subs. So the remaining sets should go into crit damage for sure, right? So this is something to do. And this will wrap up everything with regards to Blade's common misconception. Now let's move on to Blade's Relic Recommendation, because frankly speaking, compared to most of the other units that we have covered so far, Blade really doesn't have a lot of mechanic that is very, very difficult, right? Like Seele's Resurgence or Jingyuan's Lightning Lord and all this kind of stuff. Blade is just a very one-dimensional Unga Bunga unit, right? Just take on as much HP as you can and deal as much damage as possible. What Blade really needs to be tuned to raise out his maximum efficiency will be discussed in the team comp section, right? But for himself personally as a unit, he's a very, very one-dimensional, simplistic, simple to understand unit, right? So first of all, this is how our CM Bro calculated to find out what's Blade's best in slot, right? So the parameters for its comparison can be seen here, as well as the huge amount of data that our CM Bro has went ahead and discovered for himself. If you guys would like to take a closer look, feel free to scroll through this in the Google Sheet, right? But I'm not going to be explaining the numbers, right? Because this is going to take so long. What I will be explaining, however, is the summary, the summarized findings for what our CM Bro has discovered, right? Because this is what my viewers want to see anyways. You want to know the summarized version, what it essentially is Blade's best in slot, right? So just a little note, the simulation is done on a 7th turn. The boss summons 2 mobs at the start and 1 more mob at turn 4, right? And the mobs HP, they are fixed at this specific amount at level 90, 28597 to stabilize the damage simulation. And there's 2 different considerations when considering the damage simulation for Blade. One is Blade is basically a sub DPS, but in this case, our CN Bro's definition of sub DPS essentially just means he does not receive any support buffs, right? From Bronya, from Tinyu, from anybody. And if it's a main DPS, Blade is essentially just Bronya buffs, and he only factor in Bronya buffs because Bronya is the best support for Blade by a very large margin, and we'll be going into this a little bit later on in the team comp section, right? So this is just the parameters for the entire Relic Recommendations, right? So let's go forward. Rutilant Arena versus Sausoto, right? So based on these, this is for sub DPS Blade, which is just Blade himself, and this is for main DPS Blade, which is basically Blade plus Bronya, right? So as you can see over here, Rutilant Arena slightly edges out Sausoto by a mere 0.9%, right? It's an extremely small margin. Then both of these will out damage Fleetless, which increases HP and attack by, so this is going to be based on 100%, and Space Sealing Station. Like what I mentioned earlier on, Blade's attack scaling is really poor, so there is no way you want to run Space Sealing Station with Blade, right? So after looking at this, right, so these are all at E0, of course, right? So at E0 is a very minute difference, right? So it essentially boils down to which of your 2-piece has a better substats, right? But one thing to consider is that as our Eidolons for Blade goes into more and more Eidolons, especially if you manage to get Blade's E6, this will then shift the favor towards Sausoto, right? Because at E6, Blade can now trigger his follow-up every 4 stacks instead of every 5 stacks. So for all my fellow whale villagers watching this video, you guys will probably want to get Sausoto on Blade instead, right? Just because he has a much higher follow-up attack uptime, right? So this is going to be the finalized comparison between Rutilant Arena and Sausoto. Not much of a difference, but it essentially just boils down to the sub. So what should we get as like the general player base? I will honestly just advise you guys getting Rutilant because number 1, it is a little bit more, and number 2, farming for Rutilant also gives you the other 2-piece set, which is a lot more universal than Sausoto's Battle Box set, right? So because of this, I would just recommend us to just stick to World Salmon when it comes to relic farming. Now let's move on into attack versus HP versus speed boots for Blade. So as you can see from the comparison, attack is once again the worst, right? Blade just really doesn't scale well with attack. But we're gonna look at a comparison between speed boots as well as HP boots. As you can see over here, HP boots slightly edges out speed boots by a mere 2.6%, especially when you pair Blade with Bronya, right? Because, why do I say this? Blade does not generate any skill points during his enhanced state, right? Every single time he casts his enhanced state attack, he's not going to be generating any skill points. So giving Blade higher speed does not enable him to generate more skill points as a sub DPS, right? It basically just makes his turn go faster a little bit, but we're not going to gain any additional speed points. Furthermore, if you were to pair Bronya with Blade, this reduces the requirement for speed even more, because whether Blade's speed is high or low doesn't really matter, because he will always be following Bronya's speed most of the time if your Bronya is super fast, right? Because your Bronya can cast her E every single turn when you pair her up with Blade. So Blade's speed is just essentially tied to Bronya's speed, right? So that's why, generally speaking, in the best in slot situation with the best in slot team comp, which is pairing Blade with Bronya, you will always want to run HP boots on Blade, right? So this is that. If you're not gonna be running Blade with Bronya, number one, it's gonna be a lot less smooth compared to a Blade with Bronya, but if you really can't run Blade with Bronya, then I think HP boots honestly would be a pretty decent idea, right? Because you still want him to get enough speed to go ahead and cast all his skills, cast his ultimate, cast his enhanced basic attack, right? So this is if you do not run Bronya, then speed will have more value. Now let's move on into HP versus ER rope. So as you can see over here, this is for every 3 enhanced attack. So every single enhanced attack Blade does is going to be regenerating 30 energy, right? So we can always assume that this is going to have a 100% uptime, right? There is no reason why Blade will ever not be in his enhanced attack, especially since the enhanced stage only costs a single skill point and it lasts 4 turns, right? So this should always be in our considerations for energy thresholds, right? So as you can see over here, 3 enhanced attack with 2 enemy kills, right? So 1 kill is 10 energy. This will gives us 135 energy, which is above the threshold for 130, right? That's Blade's ultimate cost. Whereas if you were to bring an energy regeneration rope, this will allow us to receive 137.36 energy without killing anybody. So essentially, this guarantees us to cast our ultimate every 3 turns. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, is it realistic for Blade to get 2 kills, alright, within these 3 turns? And for me, as well as the CN bros, yes, I think this is a pretty realistic expectation because Blade is someone that has a lot of AoE in his kit, right? He has AoE on his enhanced attack, he has AoE on his follow-up, and he has AoE on his ultimate. So the CN bros really don't think it's that difficult for Blade to kill 2 enemies over the course of these 3 turns. And this allows our Blade to use our HP percentage rope, and this will of course grant us more survivability and more damage output, right? So because of this, we generally recommend using HP rope instead of ER rope on Blade. Now for our next comparison, a HP chest or a crit ratio chest, right? So this could be either crit damage or crit chance. For most DPSs, in fact for all DPSs unless you're Kafka, crit ratio will always be more preferred compared to any of the other main stats, right? Now, though crit ratio is more preferred than HP, I think this is pretty obvious. But like I mentioned earlier on, Blade has an innate 41% crit chance from his 4-piece, 2-piece, tracers, and base crit chance alone, right? Nothing from the main stats and substats, not even including his signature Lightcone. He already has 41% crit chance. So it is really easy for Blade to achieve an optimal crit ratio, even with crit damage chest, right? Even easier if you were to add Blade's signature Lightcone, which will bring his total crit chance up to 59% without a single main stat or substat, right? So generally speaking, if you're gonna be playing Blade, crit damage chest would be more optimal for Blade's damage output, right? So let's move on to our last comparison, which is HP percentage sphere versus wind damage sphere. So the two differences, this is for sub DPS and this is for main DPS. As you can see over here, the benefit for main DPS actually dropped down a little bit compared to sub DPS. And why is this the case? That is because for main DPS, we are using Bronya's skill, right? We are using Bronya's skill onto Blade. In case you guys still don't understand by now, Bronya's skill's damage percentage multiplier is exactly the same damage percentage multiplier as elemental damage, right? So because of this, the more damage percentage you have, then the less benefit it's gonna do for us. But despite this, both instances of sub DPS and main DPS, they still prefer wind damage sphere, right? For both cases. So generally as a DPS, you can't go around running wind damage sphere. But if you, in the event that you actually do get a HP sphere that has really good subs, and your wind sphere has just absolutely horrendous subs, then you can actually consider running HP sphere, especially if you're going to be using Blade as a main DPS with Bronya support, right? So this is just something to consider if you don't have very nice subs on your wind damage sphere, right? So for our final summary, right, so this is going to be our final summary. Our 4-piece for Blade is going to be our Longevous Disciple, and no other relic ever comes close. So this is going to be our only recommended 4-piece. For our 2-piece set, it's going to be Rutilant over Salsoto, over Fleetless, over Space Station, as seen from the comparison over here, right? So this is our comparison for his 2-piece. And then for our main stats, it's going to be over here, crit damage on his chest, HP percentage on his boots and his rope, as well as wind damage on his sphere, right? For our substats, it's going to be crit ratio, right? Our crit chance and crit damage over HP percentage over effect rest, right? Why do we want effect rest on Blade? Is because Blade as a unit really doesn't like to be crowd controlled, especially if you don't have Locha or if you don't have Bronya, right? If Blade gets crowd controlled, he can no longer cast his follow-up attack, and it's gonna take very long for Blade to actually cast his enhanced attack again. And with that, we have come to the end of Blade's Relic recommendation. Now moving on to Lightcone Recommendations, our CM bro has done a very nice table for us over here, and this essentially compares every single destruction Lightcone. This is for Blade's main DPS, right? 认主 C, right? So 认主 C, but I didn't include Blade's sub DPS because the chart is exactly the same. The ranking is exactly the same, it's just the numbers are a little bit different. So our Lightcone recommendation is always going to be the same, irregardless if you're a main DPS or a sub DPS for Blade, right? So looking over here, it's very obvious that Blade's S1 is going to be a lot better. I would dare say it is his best install by a long margin. The next install is going to be S5 Secret Vault, which is Eidolons Lightcone, into S1 Secret Vault, which is Iron Lightcone, and this actually out damages S1 Clara's Lightcone, which is very surprising. Then the next best install is going to be S5 Under the Blue Sky, followed by S5 Aeon, followed by this Lightcone. I'm not sure if you guys even know what this is, but this is actually our S5 Mutual Demise, which is actually a 3-star Lightcone, and I'm going to be explaining this, why this actually ranked above S1 Aeon, right? But the rest of the things we're gonna be, essentially you don't need to bother. So why is this the case, right? Now, this is the case is because, as you can see over here, attack percentage Lightcone scales very poorly with Blade, right? Like what I mentioned very early on in Common Misconception, Blade is a unit that generally do not like attack percentage scaling, right? It just scales extremely poorly. So essentially, every single of the destruction Lightcones that increases our target's attack percentage is not going to be very relevant for us, right? So why is this 3-star Lightcone actually ranked so high up, even above all the other remaining 4-star Lightcones, right? That is because Mutual Demise, it has a pretty decent uptime, right? So the effect for Mutual Demise is if you're below 80% HP, then your crit chance increases by 16%. And for Blade, the chances of him being below 80% HP is honestly very high, right? Because he has so many mechanics that reduces his own HP, and most of the time after casting his ultimate, he's gonna be at 50% HP again. So being under 80% HP with Blade is honestly really attainable. That's why this is ranked so well above the rest, right? And once again, like I said, because Clara's Lightcone is also an attack percentage scaling, it's not going to be very well. But one benefit is that Clara does have some sort of damage percentage scaling with Blade, right? After Blade gets hit. So her ranking is not completely abysmal. It is still worse enough such that she is worse than S1 Secret Vault by 0.1%, right? And S5 just heavily out damages Clara's Lightcone. But none of this compares with our Blade signature Lightcone. So if you're going to be pulling for Blade, I'll highly recommend players to get an E0 S1 instead of a E1 S0, right? Because his Lightcone is just really good on Blade, right? Really a best installed so far, right? So that is that for Blade's Lightcone recommendation. Super straightforward. Now moving on to our will section, which is the Eidolon benefits, you can see that for E0 Blade is going to be our baseline. E1 is going to go up by 15.28%, then E2, E3, E4, E5, E6, right? So this goes up all the way, and these are the respective additional damages based on an E0 Blade in comparison, right? So as you can see from the table, most of Blade's Eidolons are very consistent. There's not much massive damage boost except for E6, which is pretty big. So the biggest value for most players is going to be an E1 at a 15.28% damage increase, and E6, which is an almost 20% damage increase. So, but if you're not a whale, if you're just basically like a dolphin, getting E1 S1 is gonna be the best choice. But if you can only choose to get S1 Lightcone or E1 Blade, then S1 Lightcone is going to be benefiting you way more. Right? So generally speaking, E0 S1 is going to be benefiting more than E1 S0, right? And another thing to take note, higher Eidolons will help him scale up his follow-up attack, especially at E6, right? So once you do get E6, then whales should consider using Salsoto over Rutilant Arena, right? So that's that for the whale section. Now we've come to the final section, which I would say is the most important section with Blade. Because Blade, like I said earlier on, it is a very simplistic hero, right? So he's very straightforward and there's not much to explain. But his team comp is something that we really need to deep dive into, because Blade's team comp is very rigid if you want to bring out Blade's absolute best potential. So this is our damage chart, like how much additional damage Blade does with the help of one support. At this moment, I also would like to point out that this is not their total damage. So we're not saying that Blade is doing more damage than Seele after pairing with Bronya. This is how much additional damage the unit can do after pairing with a support. So for players who think that a power creep is happening in Honkai Star Rail, Blade is doing more damage than Seele, rest assured this is not the case, because when it comes to single target damage, Seele is undoubtedly still the best single target damage dealer in the game right now. Right, so this is just Blade plus one support, right? And the damage seen over here is against a boss and two mobs, right? So the parameters is exactly the same based on all the way up. As you can see over here, our parameters these are our parameters, right? These are all the main stats, flat stats, substats, and then all these, right? So this is our parameters. So if you guys need to take a look, just go back and take a look again, right? So with that out of the way, as you can see over here, Blade pairs extremely well with Bronya, right? Even overtaking our OG Sile Bronya pairing in a damage increase section, right? So the reasons for this, we're gonna be going a little bit more in depth later on. On the other spectrum, Blade pairs extremely poorly with Asta. So why is this the case, right? This is because none of Asta's buffs benefit Blade really well. Like I mentioned again and again, Blade does not scale well with attack percentage, and Asta's massive 70% damage buff is just not gonna do very well with Blade, right, in general. And Asta's speed buff also doesn't improve Blade's skill point spending efficiency, right? Because Blade can't spend more skill points no matter how fast he gets, right? Unlike other DPS, where the faster a DPS is, then the more skill points you can spend on the DPS. And generally speaking, a skill point always translates into more damage. But that's not the case for Blade, right? Because he's basically fixed to his skill points with his enhanced attack. So generally speaking, Blade just does not go very well with Asta, or even Ting Yun in this example, right? Because Ting Yun is also another very big attack death percentage buffer, and Blade's majority of his damage does not need to come from his ultimate, right? It's going to be coming from his enhanced attack, it's going to be coming from his follow-up attack, right? So because of this, the only real harmony support right now that can actually pair very well with Blade is only Bronya. And now we're going to be going to the more in-depth portion. An optimized Blade team comp has very strict unit requirements that other units cannot substitute. Because he's a HP scaling DPS, any other harmony support such as Asta, Ting Yun, and Yukong, they're not going to be ideal to Blade due to their constant attack percentage buff, right? Because Asta's attack buff is always going to be constant, Ting Yun's buff is always going to be tied to her skill, and Yukong's attack buff is always tied to her skill as well, right? So because of this, Blade just really does not appreciate any characters that buffs his attack majority of the time. Bronya, even though Bronya buffs Blade's attack, it is only tied to her ultimate, right? Most of Bronya's buffs are tied to her skill, which is going to be damage percentage, and that is something that Blade actually appreciates, right? So that's that. Now another thing when it comes to healers is that Blade is constantly damaging himself, right? With his enhanced attack, with his skill, with his ultimate, all that kind of stuff. And like I said once again, Blade is not a berserker unit, right? He does not like to be in low health, especially because if you're in low health, then when you cast his ultimate is not going to deal any damage to himself, right? He needs to be above 50% HP for most of the time. And as such, any other healer that pairs up with Blade might end up spending a lot more skill points than usual, right? Because Blade just really eats a lot of his own HP. So because of this, Luocha will be the best possible sustain with Blade, right? Because Luocha can provide timely skills without casting any skill points, and this will allow Blade to more frequently cast his own ultimate, right? Because he's basically always healthy. And Luocha's field also synergizes with Blade's follow-up attack, right? Because the field does proc from Blade's follow-up, and this triggers even more free heals for Blade, for Luocha, and for the entire team. And lastly, Luocha also has a cleanse, which is a very big concern for Blade if Blade is under crowd control, because he cannot use his follow-up and he can no longer heal from his enhanced attack, right? So, and because of this, Luocha is just a very good sustain character for Blade, and no other sustain right now comes close. You can't really run Japan in March 7 because, like I mentioned, Blade does not appreciate shields, and you can't really run Bailu and Natasha with Blade because even though you can, you're going to be spending a lot more skill points as a healer compared to running it with other DPSs, right? So Luocha is honestly the best possible sustain Blade. And then for Bronya is the best possible support with Blade, right? Because due to Blade's very low skill point usage, as long as Luocha has very good skill point regeneration, Bronya can pretty much always cast her skills even at E0, S0 Bronya, right? This is why Bronya pairs so good with Blade on top of Luocha, without running into any skill points issue, right? So this grants Blade's bonus turns, which further helps Blade stack up his follow-up attack stacks, and Blade generally wants to be slow, right? Because if your Blade is slow, then you can have more HP percentage, which helps him scale with his durability as well as his damage, right? So because of this, Bronya really is the best support for Blade because this always allows Blade to follow up with Bronya, and Blade's speed will be tied to Bronya's speed, right? So this has a lot more benefits. And lastly, Bronya also has cleanse, right? Which as mentioned is something that Blades really require, right? Cleanse is really important with Blade. Now, why is Blade plus Bronya out damaging Sile plus Bronya over here, right? By 5%, right? This is because Sile generally is a little bit more skill point intensive, right? Even though Sile has resurgence and he can use his auto attack, but generally Sile just uses more skill point than Blade. And in a vacuum, Bronya might not be able to always cast her E on Sile 100% of the time, whereas for Blade, Bronya can very safely cast her E on Blade every single turn, right? So that's number one. And number two, she does have a lot of self-damage percentage buffs. So Bronya's E, which is Bronya's skill, it has diminishing returns on Silly as compared to Blade, which is mostly focused on crit ratios as well as HP, right? So Bronya's E just offers Blade more value as compared to Silly, right? Yeah, so that is why Blade plus Bronya actually outdamages Blade plus Silly in terms of the additional damage. Another pairing that is not shown over here is that Blade pairs really well with AoE debuffers, right? And the only two AoE debuffers we have right now is Welt and Pella. Both of these increases Blade's AoE skills, right? Such as his enhanced attack, his follow-up, and his ultimate, right? All of Blade's skills pretty much are always going to be AoE. So an AoE defense break like Pella or an AoE imprison or pushback like Welt allows our Blade to have more turns to cast his own enhanced attack, to cast his own ultimate, and all this kind of stuff. So generally speaking, AoE debuffers are gonna pair really nicely with Blade. Furthermore, something that I left out here, Silver Wolf also pairs really nicely with Blade, even though she is not an AoE debuffer, because a lot of her debuffs are also tied to increasing Blade's additional damage, right? She is not an attack percentage scaling debuffer. She reduces res, she reduces defense, and all these things help Blade deal even more damage. So with that said, we have come to our final section, which is the sample teams. So this is basically gonna be the meta team comp for Blade, right? So Blade with Luocha with Bronya, and this Pella honestly can be with any debuff, right? It can be Pella, it can be Welt, it could even be Silver Wolf if you're just against a single mob, because Silver Wolf does have a lot of debuff capabilities, right? You have defense shred, you have res shred, you have implant weakness, all this kind of good stuff. So this could honestly be any of the Nihility characters, right? Blade, and I think this is honestly the best performing team, because any other team that you form with Blade, right, they're gonna vastly underperform compared to this team right here, right? So yeah, with that, we have come to the end of Blade's CN unit analysis. Like I said, Blade is definitely a lot more one-dimensional compared to all our previous CN unit analysis, because it's very simplistic. What we do need to focus on for Blade as a kid himself is definitely going to be his team composition, right? So generally speaking, if you're a player that does not have Bronya and you do not have Luocha, right, then I think pulling for Blade might not provide you as much value as compared to a player that has Luocha and Bronya, right? So yeah, that's all I have for today, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.